Well, I'm here today with Adam Weber. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast. We had some great conversations offline over the last month or so, and you're an author. You've got so much going on right now out there in Indiana, and I'm really excited to delve into our discussion today about leadership. So, welcome.
Thanks, Ken. I'm happy to be here.
Great, great. Well, I know we have a lot to delve into, and obviously, with your background as an entrepreneur, as a innovator in the HR world as well, there's a lot for us to dig into there. But I want to give our readers kind of a quick sense, very very fast about kind of what you're doing today. As I mentioned before, you started off as as a kind of an accidental entrepreneur, as you talk about right in your book. You got into a leadership role that way, and then moved into being an innovator and a true entrepreneur as you were starting your own business. And now you've sold your company, moved on from there. But give our listeners a quick take of what you're doing right now at 15.5.
Yeah, well, real time, and I think you shared a little bit. I had two startups, and the last one I sold to 15.5. It was an engagement measurement platform where we basically measured cultures and then coached executives on how to build these high performance teams, great cultures, etc. And now, since the acquisition, actually, I've really found an amazing role at 15.5 where I'm the chief evangelist, where I get to talk about kind of this new aspect that's happening inside of cultures where they're starting to value people in ways that they haven't before. And in some ways, I'm tasked with elevating the entire HR industry to make it more strategic. And that's sort of the mission that I'm on, is to help transition this kind of old school thought of HR, which is like payroll, benefits, administrative function, to the strategic side, which is all about leadership development, manager enablement, culture activation, vision and values, that sort of thing.
I love that. I know one of the things that we're going to touch on today, and really kind of the working theme and title for today's conversation is the fact that your job, your career does not have to be soul crushing, right? And with my industry also being in the recruiting executive search world, I'm working with HR leaders on a regular basis, and they talk about that a lot. There's such a wide variety as far as HR responsibilities. It's a very broad spectrum, right? And some people like the more strategic OD side. Some people actually prefer more the payroll and benefit administration and compliance. And there's a lot that goes on in HR, but HR is tasked with so many different things out there that there are certainly components of an HR role that can feel at times like it is soul crushing, right? So I'm curious from your perspective and the HR interactions that you have with your role also. What do you see out there in terms of the more engaging side of HR and the things that people really get super jazzed up about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And by the way, when you asked what I was doing right now, I left out like the most important thing. I realized, like, as soon as you finished answering, I also have a podcast. I'm the host of the HR Superstars podcast, which is where we talk about all these topics. So I'll bring in like top HR leaders and talk about these new subjects. So, um, but to your point on like kind of what that work is, I think there are a lot of people that when they get into HR, they have these like high aspirations. They want to impact the workforce. They maybe stumbled into HR in the way that I stumbled into entrepreneurship. They're like, they see work, they see that it's kind of broken. There's broken relationships all across the org, from executives to employees to managers to employees, and they get into it going, well, maybe this is the way that I could do something to help. And then what happens is they get into that, and oftentimes it ends up being either some combination of relegated to doing administrative work, or so dramatically chaotic, fire to fire to fire, that they end up living in kind of this ticky tack world that's really hard to elevate their career, to gain executive trust, and to kind of do some of these bold initiatives inside the company that they dreamed of doing. And those can be any number of things. I think on the far side, you've got um, leaders who are questioning the concept of the 5 day work week and going, well, what if we could be just as productive in 4 days? So that'd be like kind of the far side of that. But then the other side is like looking at the culture as a whole and looking for trends and what's broken, and diving into some of the hardest aspects of why the company's not performing, and using capacity planning, using talent development as ways to unlock growth inside of a business.
It's interesting. One of the things I always find is that, and I see this a lot on the sales side, especially. We do a lot of recruiting with sales leadership and marketing leadership. And it's amazing to me how often a superstar individual contributor salesperson, their next step in their career as they crush their numbers is to move into a sales leadership capacity. Right. And as we all know, being a good, strong salesperson is not the same as being a good, strong sales leader. And I think HR is similar in a lot of ways, right? You can be a fantastic, HR professional, whether you're doing one or two things, but moving into HR leadership, where you have to take a big step back, right, and look at the full business, the full operation, and understand the financials and the strategy and the ripple effects that your decisions in HR has across the entire organization. It's very similar. Do you have some I like to call them kind of do-overs or do-agains, but do you have some do-agains where you've seen the top performing HR leaders, something that they did early on in their career to help with that transition from a great individual contributor HR professional to now being an amazing HR leader?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge that happens across every industry, right? Or whatever your like department is that you run. I agree that sales is like the common one too, where you see some superstar gets promoted and then originally does pretty well because they're like the best person on the team and they're now kind of doing five people's jobs. And then there's this moment of like panic where they go, "Oh my gosh, I'm not running a marathon. I was running a 100-meter dash." And that is kind of the moment of where you have to learn the skill of leadership, like, and that is things like, how do I set priorities for people, how do I run effective one-on-ones, how do I give feedback in a way that's actually heard and received, and like that's a painful, how do I delegate, how am I willing to let another person fail that even though I know I could do the job better than them. And that same struggle that happens for sales leaders happens in HR. It happens all across organizations where when you are on a journey to become an executive, which most people usually don't start as executives, right? You start as an individual contributor and you work your way up. And all throughout, there are these different moments along the way where you have to shed what you used to do. You have to shed the old work and release it to other people and let those other people grow and fail. And the people whose careers get stifled or where they maybe find a sweet spot for them is when they get to a spot where they can't release anymore and they're holding too tightly. And when you hold too tightly, there's capacity. You run into capacity issues along the way.
Well, and speaking of kind of journey of whatever, whether you're an HR, whether you're an executive, whether you're a chief evangelist like your title is, which I love that title, by the way, at 15.5. But that journey, as you said, it's not a linear journey, right? Leadership is not, I'm 18 years old and I want to be a leader at age, 35 or whatever it is, and it's a straight shot up. I know very few people where that's been the case. It's usually a very jagged kind of journey along the way. I'm curious from your perspective, and you in reading your book, which is great, by the way. If our listeners haven't picked it up yet, it's called Lead Like a Human. It's fantastic. It was written several years ago, and it is just so relevant what's happening out there in the workforce today. So I highly recommend it. But one of the things that you talk about there is, you kind of described yourself as a bit of a wanderer, right, early on in your career. My impression was that you didn't expect to become this entrepreneur, this executive down the road. And so I'm curious about your journey. Share with us, if you would, a little bit about how you made that transition, how your journey eventually led you to be in the executive leadership role that you're in today.
Yeah, I definitely would call it stumbling more than intentional. It wasn't, I wouldn't say I was like, I had some big aspirations to be an executive. What really happened was, and I was a musician right out of school. I thought I was going to do music. It's not the best paying job in the world. Got married, had kids. I was like, I just need to take any job that'll have me. And so I found an entry level job. And I honestly, it was soul crushing. I remember one of my first weeks, this coworker who was like 5, 10 years older than me pulls me aside. He's like, "Hey, as long as you get here at 7:55, the boss gets here at 8, and leave at 5:05, the boss leaves at 5, you're going to be viewed as a good worker." And so I did that. And I was, even though what I was actually doing was I was working for 90 minutes a day and playing fantasy football at my desk. I was building my MySpace followers, which I picked the wrong social network. Obviously, I can't imagine what would have happened had I picked a better social network. And all the while, it was like this feeling, this deep in my pit, that was like just deep inside, that was like, you're capable of more than this. And this isn't fulfilling. Like it wasn't, and it was almost like soul crushing. And so I left that job and joined a really small business, 10-person company. And on the first day, the CEO had like one conversation with me that really set in motion the work that I do today. Um, he was like, and actually, because I know you're reading the book, there's a character named Michael. That's actually his name. I thought as a nice tribute to him, I just, name this new way to lead, call him Michael. But he said, "Hey, Adam, I don't care when you work. I don't care where you work. I'm genuinely curious, if you set your mind to it, what you're capable of accomplishing for our company." And at the time, he did this concept called results only work environment. You didn't track your hours. They didn't track how often you're in the office. It was just like, hey, here are your goals. Are you achieving your goals? And that, I don't know if that would work for everyone. It unlocked me, right? First, and I was doing sales for the business, the small business. First year, best year they'd ever had. Second year, doubled sales. And now all of a sudden you go, well, if you know how to generate revenue yourself, you have a lot of freedom in your career too. And so that was kind of how I initially got into leadership, was through that. And then I was really ready to start my own business. And so my business partner and I started our first startup. How I fell in love with leadership and got into leadership was, our little startup grew from 2 3 people to 35 people in the first like 9 months. Like we really scaled quickly. Our goal, I think our goal was to get 12 customers in our first year. We got 100.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so we sort of like, I was like thrust into management for the first time. And I was actually, that story I was saying about the sales leader, where I was giving you that example, that was just really me. Like I was a good salesperson who was having to learn how to be a leader. And I had to go through that same process. But in the process of developing my team, I started to realize, that sales isn't what I love. Like that's not the thing that's actually compelling me. I like watching people grow and develop. I like building cultures where people go like, what an amazing place to work. I can't believe this is my job. And I like helping other people, basically creating that Michael moment that he did for me. I like creating that moment in other people's lives and in their careers too.
It's incredible. I mean, I'm sure you probably have the same experience with as many folks as you interview on your podcast, and the same with my podcast here. How often you hear about one maybe two people in someone's life that really was a pivot point, right? I use the word turning point because that's the name of my company, Turning Point Executive Search. But pivot point, turning point, it's the same. But whether it's a teacher and a professor, whether it's a parent or a relative, or it's a boss that you had, I mean, if you had walked into that role, right, having come from a soul crushing position into that role, and you had the same kind of boss all over again, we might not be having this conversation today. You may have continued down that path and just thought, all right, well, this is just what it is. I don't love this sales career, but I'm good at it. It's good enough. I can get in the 5 minutes early, leave 5 minutes later than my boss, and I'm going to be just fine. But because you had that Michael in your life, right, that really helped you, that's pretty powerful. It's pretty amazing. And I love the fact that you talked about, I use the word kind of that empowerment, and leading based on results, not activity. And that's a really big conversation right now, whether it's the 4-day work week, whether it's just technology. But everybody is so used to managing by line of sight, which is what I call it, as compared to working and managing remotely today. It's a very different leadership style.
It's such a different leadership style. And I've been, it's that you'll, this is in the book too, this concept of managing toward outcomes, not hours. But what I love is that COVID really forced this conversation forward. This thing I used to just like say, and people would get, I could watch these like leaders get a little bit red in the face, like, because how they judge success pre-COVID, and a fully, especially folks who are always in an office. And I'm not saying this doesn't still happen, but it does. But is, you walk in the office and you kind of look around, and however busy people look is how productive the company is. It's a foolish way to lead in my mind. And it's easier though. What's hard is to think about with every team, every employee, what is it that we actually want? What does success look like? And then doing the work to define that success and then unblocking those people. And if you find that sweet spot where a goal is set that is stretching but realistic, and you don't create all these layers of bureaucracy and meetings, death by meetings, and toxic cultures where your employees can't bring up issues without feeling like they're failing, or you're going to have some adverse reaction toward them. Like if you get rid of that stuff and you just create radical clarity on what they're supposed to focus on, there, like, magic happens inside of organizations. Those are the fun, vibrant places that when you work, you go, this is what it's about. Like, I can't believe that this is work, and you can create these, what a gift to give to somebody, because when their work life is in harmony with who they are, their home life is in heart, it's just like a much more peaceful way to live your life.
I love that term, radical clarity. Fantastic. I think that should maybe be the title of one of our next books, but that's great. It says a lot. I mean, it's all about, it really speaks to how you lead an organization, what you're looking to, the transparency that you use to run your business as a leader as well. That all really resonates well with me. As a quick reminder, I'm talking to Adam Weber today. He's the chief evangelist over at 15Five, author of the book Lead Like a Human, has done amazing things, has his own podcast as well, all about HR superstars. So Adam has done quite a few things out there in the world today. I'm curious, Adam, about kind of where you are in terms of your own leadership journey and the things that you do today that maybe you didn't do early on, even with your first startup, right, back at Emplify. So let's talk about that in terms, and I use the term kind of, what are the do-overs, if you could. What are the things that you wish you had done back then, early on in your leadership journey, that you do now that you maybe didn't know any better back then?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things I've gotten a lot better at over time, and I'm on a journey too here. I'm nowhere near
Join
arrived.
the
I'm
club.
still in
Join the
the
club. You are not
yeah.
alone on that journey.
I'm in the middle of my career still, and so I think but one thing that helped me a lot was when I started managing functions that I didn't have mastery over. And that really helped me hone the basic fundamentals of management and leadership. I couldn't rescue people as well, and so I started collaborating with them, unblocking them, helping them learn how to be strategic. Like, someone comes to you that has function, like when you start managing directors, right, who have functional mastery over an area where you know nothing about. First time I managed HR is a great example. I was like, I don't actually know anything about HR. I've learned it since then. But I would just help them think through problems, or when they'd feel overwhelmed, I'd be like, but if we had to pick only one, if we had to say no to everything else, what would we pick? And helping them learn to flex that muscle of prioritization or focus or foresight, these different skills, helping them set goals, helping them create their strategies, things like that. I just feel like when I was earlier in my career, I would try to just brute force my way to success, and I would sort of do it on my own. So that'd be one. And I think the other, and I was curious. If I can turn the tables just to learn a little bit in a second. I just want to ask you a question about this, because this is like a mistake I made. Like,
Sure,
I think
sure.
early in my career, I had a bit of like a savior mindset when it came to hiring. I didn't believe in myself, like that I held the answers. And I thought maybe some outside person was going to come in and rescue. And so we'd work with someone like you, and we'd come to you and be like, oh man, we need to hire this salesperson. And we actually knew how to solve the problem, but we didn't believe in ourselves. And then we'd try to hire this person, and we mishired several times, not believing in ourselves and not believing in our culture and how important that was. And when you mishire, it wreaks absolute havoc. It
Oh my
stifles
gosh,
the
yeah,
growth
I
of
couldn't agree more.
your company. And I mean, so anyways, I was curious if it's okay. Can I ask you one question?
Sure,
Just
no, I
because,
love it. Yeah,
okay,
it's
we're
great.
here. I just was like thinking about this. Like,
Perfect.
we had this one moment that really like stifled growth, and mishired an executive. not a culture fit. Tons of expertise. So it wasn't an expertise issue at all, right? It was like, it's more, it just, it, so how do you like help people not get caught up in like the shiny experience? Like, oh, they've already done this. Of course it's going to be a good fit. And really think about, but is this a good fit?
Wow, that is such a great question. It probably should be a whole separate podcast conversation, honestly. And I mean, I'm laughing as I'm answering because it is something that we talk about with all of our clients, right? And we do executive level search. So we're placing people at the director, VP, and C-suite levels, primarily sales and marketing and operations, right? So there's certainly a fair amount of technicality to those roles, but the culture fit, the leadership style is really important. And I think, so a couple of things come to mind. First of all, employment brand is really important. And I think that's another way of you kind of rewording what you said a minute ago about confidence, in your own abilities, right, in your own culture. A lot of companies don't even think about their employment brand. They think about them as a brand in terms of their product or service, externally focused to customers, but there's an internal brand as well. And the technical fit when you're hiring somebody is important, but even more important, especially in those leadership positions, is that alignment with your employment brand. For example, if you are a pre-IPO company and you're in a software space and you're going a mile a minute, heading towards the IPO in the next 12, 18 months, you probably shouldn't be hiring somebody who's a new parent or who's caring for elderly parents themselves, right? And needs flexibility to work from home, who's not going to be able to work on the weekends, those kinds of things. That's a bit of a misalignment between what you need and what you are as an organization. And I think a lot of companies don't really take the time to acknowledge that. And it's not a right or a wrong thing if you're more of a 4 day a week, organization, or if you're hard driving, working 6, 7 days a week. There's not a right or a wrong inherent in that decision, but there's a right or a wrong in terms of how you bring people in and the kinds of talent that you bring in to align with that also. So I think that confidence piece goes back to understanding and owning that employment brand also. And then it's a matter, honestly, of just, when you're screening people, and this is for everybody out there, not just me as an executive search firm, but when you're screening candidates, don't look at their resume and say, oh, this person was a great sales leader at IBM. Well, I'm a tech company too, so they must be a great sales leader for my organization. That could not be further from the truth, right? The IBM, the Google, the Amazon, the Salesforce culture is very different than the majority of companies that are out there. So you really have to what we call peel back those layers and understand how they operated, how they made decisions in their organizations that led them to that success. And is that applicable for your organization, or is it a very different dynamic?
Yeah, I love that. There's so many good nuggets there. And I think the thing that I like learned myself, some of those logos I have hired
Mhm.
myself, it's very different to represent a company that everybody knows the brand versus scrappy startup that's
Very
out there
true.
trying to change the world, but nobody knows if it's going to work or not, right? And I think it's like, if you go in knowing what someone from a logo is going to bring you is stability and process. But what they're not likely going to bring is an entrepreneurial ability to solve the unknown. Somebody has to solve the unknown. And all along the way, we would bring in these people from these great companies with proven experience. And then we'd have these 22-year-olds come in and solve these really hard problems. And you're like, now this is so different. This actually worked out way differently than I expected, you know?
It's very true. And I think part of that also is that, back to the discussion about HR leadership specifically, HR has a big role in deciding who to hire. But I think hiring managers, honestly, not all of them, but some of them can get a little bit lazy. And they put that full responsibility on the shoulders of the HR leader. And they don't give that HR leader or the talent acquisition team enough information to be able to hire effectively. They just simply pull the job description off the shelf from 10 years ago, the last time they filled that job. They maybe make a tweak here or there, but they don't really think a lot about, okay, what kind of an individual, what kind of a culture do we have here? And this is what we need to do going forward versus what we did before. So the onus and responsibility is not just on HR's shoulders, but also on the shoulders of the hiring manager to do their homework and to really give that advice there as well. I want to touch on something that you said a second ago also, because I'm really curious about your experience here with HR and just leadership in general. Managing a millennial, a Gen Z and millennial workforce versus managing, Gen X like me or baby boomers, right? It's very different. All the way back to what you said a few moments ago about operating inside an office versus not, right? And that communication and transparency. Do you have to adjust your leadership style when you're working with 20 somethings versus 40 or 50 somethings?
It's a complicated question, I would
It is,
say.
it is, yeah.
Because I think you have to adjust your leadership style to every single individual, period, right? And I do think that like generations at the macro level do have kind of some different values. Like there's a fundamental value shift that happened when millennials entered the workforce. Like, for example, things like um, leadership authenticity, a company that represents a purpose that aligns to their values, personal growth and development. Is this a place I can grow? Those all were bottom kind of 10 values for Gen X and boomers. And then all of a sudden they moved up to kind of the 1, 2, 3 really high. And what's interesting though is it didn't actually uh, boomers, Gen X, they all started to shift their values too. They said, well, hold on, actually, I do care about that too. And so the whole value system of the workforce sort of changed at the macro level. And I actually think, and I don't exactly know what it's going to be, because like if you look at Gen Z right now, it's like it makes up like 7, 8%. I mean, it went from being like 1% to 7, 8% in the last like 18 months. It's a pretty quick, I could be off. Don't, let's Google those numbers later. But it
It's
is really
quite a bit
gotten,
smaller for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's smaller, but it's growing quite quickly. And I think in the same way, there's values that they're bringing into the workforce. A couple that jump out to me are flexibility, work-life balance, that I don't think are going to stop with Gen Z. In the same way that millennials impacted the entire workforce, I think you're going to find that with Gen Z too. People starting to rethink their relationship between work and life. I think those are like hypothesis right now. This isn't like a well-formed, thought, but it does feel like that's kind of what's emerging. And so then as a manager, I do think, of course, that you manage each individual differently and you don't want to go in with too many assumptions. I think the biggest assumption, if you had to make one, is that this person is not you. And so they want to be managed differently than you. And as long as you check that box and then really get to know that individual and what their goals are, what motivates them, you can manage that person in a way that unlocks their potential to the fullest.
That's a really great point. Yeah. And like you said, whether regardless of generation, age, or even experience level, each individual has to be managed according to how they want to do it. Now, granted, you and I work for manageable size companies where we can do that. If you
Yeah.
worked for IBM and you literally had, 100, 150, 200 reports under your purview, it's a little more challenging. But there's still ways to do it. For example, I'm curious about your experience with this, and I think this also is a reflection of what you said a moment ago with the changes thanks to the millennials and Gen Zs coming in. But rather than having the traditional once a year sit down for a 3-hour annual review, let's talk about what you did this past year. What did you think you did well? Here's what I think you did well. And then the stupid question, which I always hate, how can I help you be more successful? Right? Which is pointless. And everybody hates those reviews. Now that's really moved, and a lot of organizations, big and small, that's moved to what we call kind of career conversations. It's more of an organic, ongoing live discussion. It's not a 3-hour sit down once a month, but it's a 15, 30-minute check-in at least once a quarter. Right. And we're having a lot of discussions with our clients about how that's so much more important from the top down, but also it's coming bottom up because a lot of these younger employees are expecting that. They want to have an impact. They want to know that they're having an impact. Great example during COVID, none of the executive leaders out there, very few, really spoke much about what was happening in the business, how they were going to survive, what their plan of attack was going to be. And so a lot of people ended up feeling very disconnected, right? The frontline folks disconnected from leadership. And then the leadership folks were surprised a year later in 2021 when the Great Resignation happened. everybody left because there was no loyalty, right? So there's that trade out there. So I'm curious about what you see out there with the HR conversations that you're having. Have you seen a shift also in that performance review of old now being more of an ongoing career conversation?
Very much so. And that really gets, I mean, that's really the heart of like what 15.5 even is all about. It's like basically we looked at what performance reviews are, this kind of like broken, antiquated system, and tried to fix it, to create regular, consistent, steady feedback is really the way to do it. And regular, consistent performance conversations. And like when you fundamentally fix the relationship between the employee and the manager and how they relate to one another, there shouldn't be surprises at performance reviews. It's really an opportunity to kind of just zoom out just a little bit. It's real, and have a conversation that's a logical extension of many other micro conversations before that. I like your rhythm of a conversation about the future every 12 weeks. That's what I always tried to do when I was in person. That would look like a lunch once every 12 weeks. And I'd actually have like 3 questions. I would send them in advance. But I wanted to always know, like, and one way I word this that I think is helpful, I've always had a hard time with this. Like when we all pretend like we're going to work together forever, I'm like, the average tenure of a millennial is 1.8 years. Like we're not going to work together forever. Okay. So let's take that off the table. And the way that I kind of word that is like, what is it that you hope this job or this time in your life unlocks for you in your career? And that takes a little of the pressure off of like the how long you're going to stay. And I just want to know how you think about what might be next. And we can kind of like align on that so that I can be a support. Some of my proudest management has nothing to do with the fact that people's tenures were exceptionally long, but that there's people that I propelled to do their own thing. My two of my very first direct reports started their own business together. And I'm like, I just still am like, that's like the coolest thing. How amazing that they've like built their own successful business, and they were my right and left hand for years. And I get a lot of fulfillment out of that too. That of course, along the way, they were incredibly impactful to our business. They were motivated, they were driven, they helped change our trajectory. But at the same time, it's a phase, it's a season. And so I want to support them and so that they're capable and able to do something great themselves down the road as well.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I feel the same way. I had one of my favorite employees, and she had been with me for almost 7 years. And she called me up to give notice and go take this opportunity, a role that she would never have had the chance to do that at our small firm, right? She was going to be the head of talent acquisition at this pre-IPO software company. Just incredible, right? And it was a very emotional conversation of her giving notice and explaining why. But the same thing is, I was so excited for her to move on to that next step in her career, right? And you feel like you're kind of sending them out into the world. Yes, I was very sad to lose her, obviously, but you had a hand in helping to shape how they articulate themselves, how they present themselves, and their own leadership style. It feels very, very good. I'm curious. I want to get back to the idea of kind of soul crushing. So there are times where I've had experiences where I could tell an employee of mine is maybe the job they're doing is not soul crushing, but it's not really engaging or exciting to them anymore. And you can tell, right? Once you've led for long enough, you see the signs. Have you had to have those kind of anti soul crushing conversations with staff, with employees, and you were the one to bring it up to them as opposed to them coming to you and saying, "Hey, this is not working"? And how did that go?
Yeah, that's great. I think a lot of that, I think with when I manage is like these was steady and consistent one-on-ones where you're kind of having these conversations. And that, there are some jobs, by the way, that are just straight up hard. And so I experienced that a lot when I managed sales development reps, like cold callers for a long time. And a lot of them, like there's about an 18-month window where you can do that role successfully. And then it just kind of is like it starts to tap into that.
Yeah, it
And so
becomes
one
it
one
becomes a grind very quickly. I agree.
yeah, I mean, and
Yeah.
and so if there is a job that's a grind, it has to have a reason in your life to be a grind, to sustain, right? And so if it's and so there's kind of two paths, I think, is like one, just naming that, hey, this is a hard job. It's a hard job to do for a sustained period of time. Why are you doing this job? What are you hoping this opens up for you in your life? Is it to get the next promotion here? And so if so, let's make sure that we're both because it's hard. And I don't want you to basically, if you get so worn out, your performance starts to dip, right? That's not going to get you out of this cycle. You're going to be stuck in this kind of endless loop of these, and you want to help people propel and move up. So I think just this, I mean, this is just part of how you lead now, is just with a deep transparency. It's a transparency in how you think. Like, you can share things even that are like, hey, I just want you to know, when I'm thinking about promotions, here are the things I'm looking for, and letting people know where they stand against that. Peeling back the curtain on how you make your own decisions, I think, goes a long way for people too. And I also think it's okay to be like, I actually had a situation like this recently too, where you just name that, what the role needs and what you need, and just put it on the table. Might be different. Like, hey, I'm sensing that, like, this is a thing that brings you energy and vitality in your life and career, and yet the role is moving in this direction, where it actually needs more of kind of the thing that pulls you away from that vitality. And I'm just processing, and I want to process with you, like, what we might do about that. And a lot of times for people, that like, it's clarifying that, oh wow, I it I have been wrestling with these things internally, but when you said it, it's kind of like it was a catalyst to go, it's time. Like, it's time to do something else.
Yeah,
And
and it's
there's
great permission
yeah.
too, right? Because you're giving them permission to be vulnerable, and you're, like you said, you're labeling it, you're owning it, and it gives them a chance to really be, very transparent and very honest with you as their leader.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can end on such positive, like, if that's the end, there's natural ends, right? And rhythms, and you can end on this natural kind of managed out in a positive way that get maintains their dignity, that honors their tenure when they were there, to go, what a cool impact you had on the business. And then we got to a time where it was clarifying to you what was next. And clarifying for the business what the business needs. And there's a dignity to the whole thing that I feel like just still feels a little broken in our world today, that I think is solvable.
And there's so much discussion out there about employee engagement, which I know is obviously what you live and breathe these days at 15.5. One of the things I'm kind of curious about is when you're gauging employee engagement, and you're tracking it, right, and you're trying to provide solutions to improve it. Are you talking to employees about what's engaging to them both inside and outside of their organization and their job? What, for example, what comes to mind is, side hustles. And there's a lot of discussion out there about whether or not side hustles are okay. And not to use one brush to paint everybody, but typically, right, more seasoned CEOs say, no, my employees should be only my employees, and that's all they should do. They shouldn't be doing these other things. Whereas, earlier career CEOs have a different perspective. So I'm really interested to hear from you in the engagement work that you do. Is that part of the conversation? What's engaging you, and what's exciting to you inside, but also outside of the walls of this job?
Yeah. No, that's an interesting way to think of it. I actually haven't thought of it like that. So the work we do with engagement is really about the employee to their employer relationship, and it basically took this concept that used to feel really squishy, and it makes it scientifically valid, and it kind of gets at the root of how an employee thinks about the business in their head, how they feel about the business in their heart, and then how that's impacting the work they do. Like, are they motivated to give extra? Do they feel like their discretionary effort gets applied toward the business? Like, do they have more to give? And the simplest way I could describe it is, like, what breaks cultures is when teams of people all have a common problem. And so when teams of people, and we kind of break engagement down into 17 different like 17 different traits, like psychological safety, their manager, fairness, leadership availability. There's, I could go on and on, alignment to the company's vision. But where cultures break down is not just when one person's having an isolated issue. It's when a collection of people are having a common issue, like manager and feedback, right? Two drivers both working in tandem together, or a two that we see often, capacity. Like, I actually don't have the resources to accomplish this job, and goal support. The goals aren't achievable. Well, when you don't have the resources available to you, and you don't think you can hit your goals at a macro level, the whole team, that causes destruction for companies. So that's really like the type of engagement work we do, is we dive into the things that employees are feeling, and then we expose to executives the real truth of the business, and then help them actually solve those challenges.
Sorry for the dog
That's
barking.
okay. No worries. Happens to me all the time.
I love it. Yeah,
Leave
exactly.
it in.
Yeah. Make it real. Make it real,
This is
right?
real world.
Exactly right. No, that's a good point you bring up, and I think that it's back to your point around transparency and and whether it's a career conversation or anything else out there, it's so important that you're having that ongoing dialogue and the ability to really let your employees know, hey, we want to track this information. We want to get a feel for what's out there and what's affecting you inside your role and long term. But we also want you to share with us. Right. And so asking those questions, I'm sure, is a big part of that, and being able to really understand kind of what they're all about. Do
Yeah.
you, do you, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say asking is a big part.
Yeah.
Listening is a bigger part,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
then doing something about it is the biggest part. But there really is a kind of magic, like something really powerful happens inside of an organization when employees share the truth of their experience, and then a leader acknowledges their experience as true, even the hard stuff. That alone diffuses so many issues. To go, yes, agree, this is a challenge. You just feel this collective deep breath to go, okay, now we're all on the same page. So now we can actually get about the business of solving it.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to actually ask the questions. And I worked for Enterprise Rent-A-Car early on in my career coming out of college. And when I was joking before about that question that I hate about, tell me how I can, make your job more successful. That was the most hollow, emptiest question we all got. And we were all 22, 23 years old. Our first job was out of college, right? We didn't know any better as those young employees, but we get those questions from our leaders all the time when we were back in the early 90s at Enterprise, and they asked the question. They couldn't have cared any less about our answer. Nothing changed. They weren't really hearing it. They'd ask the same question 1 year later, and nothing had changed in that 1 year period. No matter how clear you were to say, hey, here's what I need from you, Mr. and Mrs. Boss, to help me be better, nothing changed, right? So it's one thing to ask the question, but it's to your point, listening, and then the third stage of actually doing something about it within reason, of course. That's huge. That goes a long way to get your employees to realize, okay, they do want to make a difference. They are listening to me, and what I say to them is important. What about, so from, I'm going to switch gears a little bit in terms of talking about kind of the hiring perspective. And this comes from a lot of personal experience also. There's such a discussion out there about the value of a formal education, right? A 4 year college degree. Is that as valuable as it once was, right? And maybe the question should be, was it ever as valuable as we made it out to be? But that's a separate issue. The question today is, when it comes to hiring and leading and then also promoting from within, do you feel like a formal education is a precursor, or I guess a prerequisite to someone being a good leader? Or can somebody lead well, with just having been scrappy and come up through their career without having gone to college?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think, and definitely a topic that comes up a lot. I think, well, one, it definitely depends on the job. So if we're
Sure,
talking about
sure. Fair enough.
doctors and nurses and architects and engineers, like, yeah, I think that I want them to have a formal education.
Right. They
I get
probably
a
should have
li-
done some experience before they, did surgery on me, work surgery on me.
I'm a surgeon, but well, I'm self-made. I'm a self-made
Exactly right.
surgeon. No, no, no. Um, no, so yeah, so some jobs obviously require some technical skills. And I do think there's a reevaluation though on the impact of, like, for those non-technical jobs, learn skills, on-job training. Um, and I feel a little myself like there's a part of me that values especially if you're measuring someone early in their career, the commitment of like finishing something, right? Like, of like, you did this thing that was challenging in your life and you learned how to learn too, which is a really cool aspect of college, is like you take a wide variety of classes and you solve these. So there's a part of me that like loves that. There's also another part of me that feels like it likely is perpetuating some inequalities inside of our culture that need to be reassessed, or it's just like not actually needed, you know? So I don't know. I sort of float all around, I think, on this topic.
Yeah, and I've certainly, to your point, I've had my share of placing, senior executives that have, have a bachelor's and a master's and, an MBA and the like. And there's certainly a lot of value in that. I don't want to underplay it for sure. But I've also placed presidents and CEOs that never got a college degree because they were working in high school. Then they
Yeah.
got an offer for a full-time job right out of high school, and just they were learning on the street, right? They were getting the real world MBA at 18 because they were working for Xerox or IBM or J&J or whoever it was. And it's like I said earlier, there's not any right or wrong and inherent in that question, but it's a conversation that we're having now, which we haven't had for a very, very long time, I think.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely. I think that's a perfect way to say it. It's a conversation. I think it's a conversation now, and of course, I do believe that so much of what I've learned isn't from like what I feel like what I learned in college was how to learn. That was a great skill. And it was very valuable to me. I have a master's degree in organizational communication. Who would
Sure.
have thought? I didn't know I was going to do anything in that field. And then now that's like that is my field, you know? And so
Right,
that
right.
was more happenstance than intentional. But I think a lot of the genuine learning for me has been just getting my hands dirty in business, trying, failing, researching, hitting another problem, roadblock. And, that's really where so much of great growth happens. And also, another reason to be transparent as a leader is to help other people grow. Because when you're transparent and you start to tell them some of the things you think about the business, you're kind of giving them a little bit of that mini MBA for themselves too.
That's a really good point. And I always think back about around the whole conversation around diversity as well. And a lot of companies really genuinely do want to create a more diverse workforce. And I use the term diversity of thought. It's not solely gender or age or ethnicity. It's a broad spectrum. But if you look at the way historically companies have hired, the language that they use in a lot of job descriptions, requiring a four-year degree, for example, that cuts off a lot of people, right?
Exactly.
Minorities tend to have a smaller percentage that have college degrees versus white males, right? Or if there's language in your job description that uses words like bold and aggressive and hard driver and things that are very masculine terms, that tends to turn off a lot of female candidates. So a lot of these companies that are looking to diversify their workforce, and yet they don't look at the way that they hire or the language that they use when attracting candidates, there's a bit of a misalignment there as well.
Yeah, exactly. That I feel like you just laid out such a perfect use case of what strategic HR is inside of an organization too. I think 5 years ago, we kind of went through a lot of the things you just laid out, where we took out the college degree on jobs where we didn't feel like it was actually beneficial, especially jobs that where someone was trying to get their foot in the door, and we would assess more on like skills, and then we did language audits on every single job description we created for that same reason. And by the way, it did work, and then we did
Well,
bias
so it made a
training
difference.
too.
That's great that you're able to
Yeah,
track that. Yeah.
it did make a difference. And
Yeah.
we also did bias training too, unconscious bias training. So right before every interview, there's a document that we reviewed. We created consistency in our interview process, which was really like we were sort of we were a startup and it was Wild West. And I think one of the things that really helped us was finding the balance of being authentic during the interview process, like so that a prospective employee knows what it feels like to work there. Like they get a genuine sense. Like some companies you interview and it's like this one experience and then you show up, it's very different. I wanted our interview experience to feel just incredibly consistent with who we are, but then also creating some guardrails inside of like the types of questions we ask, what we're listening for, so you can actually genuinely compare candidates and not just go, well, I want to hire that person because they kind of feel like me, you know, and like help prevent that, which does happen a lot.
Happens a lot, yeah. And I have a story I talk about actually in my book also. We had a client, maybe this is 7-8 years ago, give or take, and this was the CEO of a company. We were trying to hire a very senior level marketing executive, and we're going through our discovery call. Okay, what are you looking for? And he literally says to us, I want to hire someone that can be my best friend. And so we, as an executive search firm, are thinking, oh wow, where do we go with that? Right? We're not screening people for friendship, capability. This is someone that can do the job, that's going to be aligned with your culture, certainly. And you don't want somebody who's going to be a jerk that you never want to talk to outside of the 9 to 5 job. But we're not going to be able to screen people to hire a friend, and you shouldn't be looking for people to hire because they could be friends. That's not what the purpose of you being a business leader is. It was
Right.
just, it's always stuck in my mind.
I feel like this is you telling me that Dunder Mifflin was your
Right.
one of your clients. You're humble bragging right now. You're
I wish
like,
I could say it was a fictional company. Unfortunately, it was not. But it was kind of interesting. All right, so last discussion point here, and I know because again we talked about your early career and kind of falling into being an entrepreneur and being a leader. What advice or even just kind of guidance and hey, things to be aware of do you give to aspiring leaders that are out there that are either on the cusp of making that transition from individual contributor to leadership, or they're starting their careers and they think, I do see myself as a leader long term? What kind of guidance do you give to them, or would you give to them?
well, I think one would be find a couple people who you really respect and just reach out and see if you can't get, meet with them. I was surprised how early in my career I was, people were willing to meet with me, and I built some amazing contacts from people who really shaped how my career ended up. I also think that cultivating your like inner self is actually like surprisingly important to leadership. Really getting to know yourself. Like if you work and try to aspire to become a leader from a place of desperation, it all the stuff that you've been holding inside will manifest itself in a moment of stress at your employee, toward your employees, and like that isn't really what the workforce values, and it's not really good for you either. It's an exhausting way to lead. And so I think finding joy in leadership, finding joy in like the journey of like part of a leader is getting to know yourself really well and just acknowledging that it's going to point out your blind spots. And so when that happens, it doesn't mean you're not meant to be a leader. It means that you've got a new thing to work on.
Yeah, and I think that transparency within a business. The flip side of that, I think, is self-awareness. Right. You have to not only have transparency and open communication with your boss or your peers and those kinds of things, but also with yourself. And this is probably because I've been married to a marriage and family therapist for 31 years. So it's coming out in that comment. But that self-awareness is so important. You're not going to know if you're getting yourself into a soul-crushing career unless you know exactly what does lift you up, to your point. What is engaging? What are you passionate about? Where do you see yourself? What's your superpower? Where do you see yourself making an impact? If you don't have that self-awareness and that honest conversation with yourself, it's going to be very difficult along the way.
Yeah, and also the reality is as you move up in your career, those blind spots that you're talking about, they less and less people tell you about them because of
Very
your
true.
role.
Very
But
true.
yeah, so because of your role power, you kind of accidentally start to have your ego inflated, thinking that you're better than you are. And so it's really important that you have people in your life that'll tell you the truth of who you are, that you create safe environments where maybe even your employees can do it a little bit. They're not going to do it as well as like it. Role power is a real thing. It's a dynamic that impacts relationships. And so it's important that you have people that tell you the truth about those blind spots.
I agree. I agree. Well, I have one last question for you, but before I get to that, Adam, where can people find you? What's the best way to them to get a hold of you?
Probably the best place is LinkedIn. I post almost every day. I'm trying to post thoughts on my, views on leadership, strategic HR, and how to build great high performance cultures. So if you go to LinkedIn /meet Adam, is probably the easiest way, or you can listen to the podcast at HR Superstars. Type it in anywhere. It's at all the places.
Wonderful. And picking up your book as well. Like I said, lead like a human. That's what it's all about. I love the book. Okay. So my last question for you, and then we'll wrap things up here, is with regard to mentorship. If somebody is, even if they're already a leader, right, but either earlier career or already a leader, and they're looking for someone as a mentor to to help them with their leadership skills, recommendations, ideas of where to go or how to go about that process of finding somebody.
So are you saying this is a seasoned person who's wanting to mentor or someone who wants to find a
Sorry,
mentor?
somebody who's looking to looking to find a mentor for
Okay, finding.
themselves. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. That is a great question. I'm trying to think like practically how to do that, you know. I was maybe a little like on the courageous side with doing that. So for me, when early in my career, I was like, oh, I want to be a CEO of a nonprofit, like an executive, and so I reached out, just cold outreach to the United Way CEO and was just like, hey, I would love to have your job someday. Is there
Oh
any way you'd meet
wow,
with me?
that's very courageous. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? I did, and they said yes, and it was like, and it was. I actually think back to that. I was probably 23 at the time, and I was like, what a cool person that she was like willing to sit with me and talk to me, and so all along the way, I mean, honestly, if you're just early in your career, like just try, be willing. Don't take no's too personally. People are really busy. But just try, and every now and then, what's funny is that my business partner just actually how we started our business. Our first business was he was in college and he reached out to me and said, hey, I'd love to learn from you. Could I grab a cup of coffee? And then sure enough, he ends up being my boss and we started a business together. And so you never know. I'll just say this, you never know when people are reaching out for a cup of coffee when it's going to be something that ends up changing your life either.
And you never know how you can learn from that person also. Even if you don't become a formal mentor for them, you just never know how it's going to change your life, and you're going to learn something from them no matter what their age happens to be that you didn't know before that conversation. That's great advice.
Yeah,
Love that.
exactly. And I think for all of us too, I work with a couple people. We have a couple really talented early career folks on the marketing team at 15.5. And they have been, they just, there's so much energy that I get from those interactions. There's a creativity and a vitality. There's like the way that things have been done is sort of, there's aspects of it that feel irrelevant because they're like, we can just do it a new way. And, I just feel really energized by that too. Like it's really helpful for me at this, like where I am in my career, to be surrounded by that.
No, I agree completely. Yeah, it's one thing I thought I would have it figured out after 3, 5, 7 years of owning a business. I thought I'd have it figured out. Here I am, 16 years into my company, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So, to your point, doesn't matter where you happen to be. Well, thank you, Adam. This has been a great conversation. I want to thank you for being vulnerable and being open and transparent about your journey. I want to thank our audience as well for listening and engaging with us. We'll get some great comments, I'm sure, along the way. And looking forward to staying in touch with you and seeing how things progress and evolve at 15.5.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me.